The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from Maribel's bones, the breath from her lungs, and the last shred of hope from her heart. For 3 days, it had been her only companion, a merciless shepherd driving her across the vast, unforgiving plains of the Wyoming Territory. The advertisement, folded and worn to softness in her pocket, had felt like a prayer answered. Housekeeper wanted. Callahan Ranch. Inquire within. It had promised work. Shelter. It had promised a place to disappear. Now, seeing the ranch for the first time, she wondered if she had prayed to the wrong god. It was less a home and more a scar upon the land, a collection of dark, timbered buildings huddled against the base of a slope that rose into snow-dusted peaks. The main cabin was a grim, 2-story affair of hewn logs, chinked with mud and defiance. A barn stood beside it, its wood weathered to the color of old bone. There was no sign of life save for a thread of smoke clawing its way from a stone chimney into the bruised twilight sky. This was not a place of welcome. This was a place of survival, raw and isolated, a fortress against the wilderness that pressed in from all sides. Maribel smoothed the front of her threadbare dress, a useless gesture against the grime of the road and the weariness that had settled deep into her marrow. Her hands were raw, her face chapped, but it was the hunger that gnawed sharpest, a hollow ache that made her lightheaded. She had walked the last 10 miles from the stagecoach drop, a solitary speck in an endless landscape. The driver had looked at her with pity. "Callahan's place? That's a long way from God's ear, miss." He was right. Here, the only sound was the keening of the wind and the frantic beat of her own heart. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing ice, she walked toward the cabin and knocked on the heavy plank door. The sound was swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles rapping against the cold, unyielding wood. Seconds stretched into a minute. She was about to turn away, to let the prairie swallow her whole, when the door groaned open a few inches. A man's face appeared in the gap, shadowed and severe. He was not what she expected. He was younger, for one, perhaps not yet 30. A jagged scar, white and puckered, cut a path from his temple down his jaw, pulling at the corner of a grim mouth. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were narrowed with suspicion. They took her in from head to toe, her ragged dress, her worn-out boots. The desperation she knew was plain on her face. "What do you want?" His voice was a low rumble, rough as gravel. I've come about the advertisement," Maribel managed, her own voice thin and reedy. "For the housekeeper position." The man's gaze hardened. He opened the door wider, stepping out onto the porch to look down at her. He was tall, built with the hard, lean muscle of a man who wrestled life for a living. He wore denim trousers tucked into muddy boots, and a flannel shirt that was stretched taut across his broad shoulders. He smelled of pine smoke, leather, and something else, something wild and untamed, like the land itself. "I was expecting a woman," he said flatly. Maribel blinked. "I am a woman." "I was expecting someone older, someone sturdier." His eyes raked over her again, and she felt a flush of shame at her own thinness, the way the wind pushed her dress tight against her slight frame. He saw her not as a person, but as a tool, and a fragile one at that. "I am a hard worker, sir," she said, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. "I can cook and clean and mend. I can do whatever is needed." He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The wind whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and she pushed it away, her fingers trembling slightly. He noticed the tremor. Of course he did. A man like this would notice everything. "The town is a day's ride from here," he said, not as a piece of information, but as a warning. "There's nothing out here but dirt and work and silence. It's no place for a girl like you." The word girl stung. She was a woman grown, one who had seen and suffered more than he could likely imagine. But she held her tongue. Arguing would get her nowhere. Begging would be worse. "I am not afraid of work, sir, or silence." He grunted, a sound of disbelief. "It's getting dark. You can stay the night in the barn. I'll give you a ride back to the stage stop in the morning." It was a dismissal, a final, crushing no. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She could not go back. There was nothing to go back to but the whispers, the accusing stares, the suffocating memory of a tiny, unmarked grave. "Please," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. "Just one day. Let me show you. If I am not what you need by tomorrow evening, I will leave without a word." He stared at her, his jaw tight. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in those gray eyes. Not pity, but something akin to it. A weariness, perhaps. As if her desperation was just one more burden on a list of many. "One night," he said, his voice clipped. "You can sleep in the cabin, but do not think this changes anything. The name is Bo Callahan. You will call me Mr. Callahan." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," she said, relief washing over her so intensely her knees felt weak. "My name is Maribel." He gave a curt nod and turned back inside, leaving the door open for her to follow. The inside of the cabin was as stark as the outside. A long table and benches dominated the main room. A stone fireplace, large enough to roast a whole hog, took up most of one wall, its flames casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn log walls. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. It was a man's space, stripped of any comfort or softness. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the plank floor, no pictures on the walls. Just the bare necessities of survival. He gestured toward a pot on the hearth. "There's stew. Eat. Then you can clean up." He did not wait for a reply, instead taking a rifle from a rack by the door and heading back outside, closing the door firmly behind him. Maribel stood alone in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on her. She was in, for one night at least. She ladled some of the stew into a bowl. It was thin but hot, filled with chunks of venison and potatoes, and she ate it so quickly she barely tasted it. Then, as he had instructed, she began to work. She washed the pot and the few dishes with a quiet efficiency, her movements economical and practiced. She swept the floor, straightened the blankets on a cot in the corner, and stoked the fire. She worked not just to prove herself, but to keep the darkness at bay. As long as her hands were busy, her mind could not wander to the places she dared not go. When she finished, she found a lantern and made her way to the barn, drawn by the soft nicker of a horse. The barn was cavernous and smelled of hay and animals. In one of the stalls stood a magnificent bay gelding. The horse shifted its weight, favoring one of its forelegs. Maribel came closer, speaking in a low, soothing tone. She saw it then, a deep, ugly gash on its upper leg, crusted with dirt and blood. It was swollen and hot to the touch. Without a second thought, she went to the pump outside, filled a bucket with icy water, and found a box of what looked like clean rags in the tack room. For the next hour, she worked on the horse. She gently cleaned the wound, her touch firm but kind, murmuring soft words to the animal as it stamped and shivered. She found a jar of salve on a shelf, a pungent mix of pine tar and lard, and carefully applied it to the injury before wrapping the leg with strips of a clean rag. The horse, as if sensing her intent, eventually grew calm under her hands, leaning its great head against her shoulder in a gesture of trust. When she was done, she stood back, her body aching with a satisfying weariness. She had done something good, something useful. It was a feeling she had not known in a long, long time. She was running a hand down the gelding's neck when Bo Callahan appeared in the doorway of the barn, holding a lantern aloft. The light threw his scarred face into stark relief. He said nothing, simply watched her for a moment. His gaze moved from her to the horse's bandaged leg. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. His leg was injured. "Mr. Callahan, I cleaned it and put some salve on it. I hope that was all right." He walked into the stall, running a hand over the horse's flank before crouching to inspect her handiwork. He touched the bandage lightly, his expression unreadable in the flickering lantern light. He stood up slowly. "Where did you learn to do that?" My father raised horses," she said, the lie coming easily. Her father had raised nothing but fear. She had learned from the town doctor, a kind old man who had let her help him when she was a girl, before everything. Callahan just grunted and turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. "There is a room in the loft. It is small, but it is warmer than the barn." He walked away without another word. Maribel understood. It was not an offer of kindness. It was a practical decision. She was more useful if she did not freeze to death. Still, a tiny, fragile seed of hope took root in the barren soil of her heart. She had survived the first night. The days that followed fell into a spare, demanding rhythm. Maribel rose before the sun, lighting the fire, making coffee, and preparing a breakfast of bacon and biscuits. Beau Callahan would eat in silence, his eyes focused on something far beyond the cabin walls. Then he would leave, disappearing into the vastness of his land, and Maribel would not see him again until dusk. She spent her days in a flurry of work. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, baked bread, and tended a small vegetable patch she found behind the cabin, choked with weeds. The work was hard, her muscles screaming in protest, but she welcomed it. It was a shield. The land itself was a constant, formidable presence. Some nights, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the very logs of the cabin. Other nights were so still the silence felt like a weight, broken only by the yip and howl of distant coyotes. The sound no longer frightened her. It was a lonely sound, she thought, a cry for a companionship that would never come. She understood it. In those quiet moments, when her hands were still, the past would rush in to fill the void. She would be back in her father's parsonage, the air thick with the smell of old paper and righteous fury. She could feel the sting of his hand, hear the venom in his voice as he condemned her for the sin that grew within her, an abomination. He had called her, a stain upon this house of God. And then would come the sharper, more unbearable memory, the small, cold room, the hours of agonizing pain, and then the tiny, perfect face of her son, Samuel. He had lived for only 2 days, 2 precious, fleeting days where she had known a love so fierce and pure it had terrified her. She had buried him herself, at night, in a small, unmarked grave at the edge of the woods, while the town slept, unaware of the small life that had flickered and died in its midst. When her secret was discovered, the shunning had been swift and absolute. She was a fallen woman, a disgrace. She had not been cast out. She had been erased. Fleeing had been her only option. One afternoon, seeking a moment of peace, she walked behind the barn. There, under the shade of a lone, wind-twisted cottonwood, was a single grave. It was marked by a simple wooden cross, the name Eleanor carved into the wood. There were no dates, no words of love or sorrow, just the name. She watched from the cabin window as Beau sometimes went there. He would stand for a long time, his hat in his hands, his back ramrod straight. He never knelt. He never touched the cross. He just stood, a solitary monument of grief. She saw in him the same thing she felt in herself, a deep, hollowed-out space that nothing could ever fill. He was as haunted as she was. Their interactions remained minimal, practical, a shared glance across the dinner table, a curt nod of thanks when she handed him a hot mug of coffee. But underneath the silence, something was shifting. She no longer saw just the harsh rancher. She saw the loneliness in the set of his shoulders, The pain he held tightly behind those stormy eyes, and she sensed, was beginning to see something in her beyond a pair of working hands. He seemed confused by her quietness, by the gentleness she could not hide when she tended to his animals or left a small bowl of wildflowers on the table. These were things that had no place in his world of harsh necessity, and they unsettled him. The first snow of winter arrived without warning, a thick white blanket that descended overnight and smothered the world in silence. The cold deepened, seeping through the cracks in the cabin walls. That night, a storm blew in from the north, a blizzard of furious wind and blinding snow. The cabin groaned under the assault. Maribel could not sleep. The howling of the wind was too much like the voices from her past. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went downstairs to sit by the fire. The main room was empty. Callahan's cot was neatly made. He had not come in yet. An hour passed, then another. Worry, an unfamiliar and unwelcome emotion, began to prick at her. No man, no matter how tough, should be out in a storm like this. She peered through a crack in the door, but all she could see was a swirling vortex of white. Then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost lost in the wind, a sound of pure anguish. Her heart pounding, she pulled on her worn coat and boots, lit a lantern, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, stealing her breath. The snow was already calf-deep. She held the lantern high, its light a feeble defense against the oppressive dark. She found him near the side of the barn, slumped against the wall, a half-empty bottle of whiskey lying in the snow beside him. He was covered in a layer of white, his hat gone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He was shivering violently, his body racked with tremors he could not control. As she got closer, she realized the sound she had heard was him. He was crying, not with loud sobs, but with silent, wrenching tears that tracked paths through the snow on his scarred cheeks. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of such profound, naked grief that she had to look away. Her first instinct was to reach out, to touch him, to offer some word of comfort, but she knew that would be a violation. A man like Bo Callahan would not tolerate such a witness to his weakness. He would hate her for it, and so she did the only thing she could think to do. Quietly, she unwrapped the wool shawl from her shoulders, the last thing her mother had given her only possession of any value. She stepped forward and gently draped it over his broad, trembling shoulders. He did not stir. He seemed lost in a world of his own making, a world of pain she could only guess at. She did not speak. She did not linger. She simply covered him, an anonymous act of warmth in the middle of a cold, merciless storm. Then, as quietly as she had come, she turned and walked back to the cabin, the wind and snow swallowing her footsteps, leaving him alone with his ghosts and her shawl. She returned to the hearth, her heart aching for him, for herself, for all the lonely, broken souls in the world. She knew he would never mention it, but she also knew that something had just passed between them in the heart of the blizzard, something more real and more powerful than any words could ever be, and it frightened her more than the storm ever could. The shawl was never mentioned. The morning after the storm, Maribel found it folded neatly on the bench by the hearth, clean of snow. When Bo Callahan came in for breakfast, his face was a mask of stone, the scar on his jaw a livid white against his weathered skin. His eyes were clear, but shadowed with a weariness that went deeper than a night spent with a bottle. He did not look at her. He ate his biscuits, drank his coffee, and went out into the blinding white world without a word. The distance between them had returned, wider and colder than ever. But the storm had been a harbinger. Winter seized the land and held it in a merciless grip. The world shrank to the cabin, the barn, and the short, treacherous paths between them. Snow drifted as high as a man's chest, and the temperature dropped so low that the very air seemed to crackle. For weeks on end, they were utterly cut off from the world. During this time, 2 other men who worked the ranch, a grizzled old hand named Silas and a younger, quieter man called Jebediah, were confined to the bunkhouse. Maribel's duties expanded. It was no longer just about keeping the cabin. She now cooked for all of them, hauling pots of steaming stew and fresh bread through the biting wind to the small outbuilding where the men slept. They were gruff, solitary men, but they treated her with a clumsy respect. Silas, who had a face like a wrinkled boot, would nod and say, "Mighty fine, ma'am." After every meal, Jebediah would just dip his head, a faint blush on his young cheeks. They and Bo saw her strength. They saw her haul buckets of water from the half-frozen pump, her slight frame braced against the gale. They saw her split kindling with a small axe, her movements sure and steady. They saw a resilience they had not expected, a toughness that was not born of muscle but of sheer, unbending will. Bo watched it all, his expression unreadable. He never offered praise, but he stopped looking at her as if she were a fragile thing about to break. He began to look at her as if she were a part of the ranch, as much a fixture as the stone chimney or the unyielding fence posts. In the long, dark evenings, after the work was done and the men had retired, Maribel found a new way to keep the shadows at bay. Bo had a box of discarded wood scraps he used for kindling. With a small whittling knife she had found in a drawer, she began to carve. Her hands, chapped and rough from work, moved with a surprising delicacy. Out of the raw wood, small figures emerged. A fawn with impossibly slender legs, a hawk with its wings outstretched, a tiny, sleeping fox, curled into a perfect circle. She was not carving animals so much as she was carving feelings, innocence, freedom, peace. It was a quiet act of creation in a world defined by harsh survival. She would sit by the hearth, the firelight dancing on her focused face, a pile of wood shavings gathering at her feet. More than once, she looked up to find Bo watching her from the shadows of the room. He would be sitting in his chair, a book lying open but unread in his lap, his gaze fixed on her hands, on the small creature taking shape within them. He never spoke. He never asked what she was doing or why. He just watched, his silence a heavy, tangible thing. She did not know if he approved or disapproved, if he found her pastime foolish or intriguing. But his watching felt like a kind of attention she had never known, quiet and intense, and it made her heart beat a little faster. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a feeling Maribel had long thought dead began to stir within her. It was a sense of safety. Here, in this brutal, isolated place, under the roof of this silent, scarred man. She was not judged. She was not the preacher's fallen daughter. She was not the woman who had borne a child in shame. She was simply Maribel, the woman who cooked the meals, tended the stock, and carved animals from wood. Her days were hard, but they were simple. Her past was a locked room inside her, and for the first time in years, she felt she might have the strength not to open the door. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent now, their edges softened by the sheer physical exhaustion of her days. Her growing comfort made her careless. One afternoon, while tasked with organizing a cluttered bureau in Bo's room, a space she rarely entered, she found it, tucked at the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of starched collars he never wore, was a small, tin-framed photograph. It was a portrait of a young woman, no older than 20. She was beautiful, with a cascade of blonde hair and a smile that seemed to light up the world. Her eyes sparkled with a life and a joy that Maribel could not even imagine possessing. She wore a delicate lace dress and held a bouquet of wildflowers. She looked soft and happy and deeply loved. Maribel stared at the image, a strange mix of curiosity and sorrow twisting in her gut. This must be Eleanor, the woman from the grave behind the barn. This was the source of Bo's profound, unending grief. She heard footsteps on the stairs and her heart leaped into her throat. She tried to slide the photograph back into its hiding place, but it was too late. Beau stood in the doorway, his face darkening like a thundercloud. His eyes locked on the photograph in her hand. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. I was just cleaning. Mr. Callahan, I found it. I didn't mean to pry." He strode across the room and snatched the photograph from her grasp, his fingers brushing hers. His touch was cold as ice. He stared at the image for a long moment, his jaw working, and when he looked back at her, his eyes were filled with a chilling fury. "Who is she?" Maribel whispered, unable to stop herself. "She's dead," he said, the words like chips of stone. He turned away from her, his broad back a solid wall of rejection. "Do not ask again." He did not raise his voice, but the cold finality of his command struck her with the force of a physical blow. The fragile sense of safety she had built around herself shattered into 1,000 pieces. She had trespassed. She had touched the sacred, broken heart of his past, and he had thrown her out without a second thought. She fled the room, his words echoing in her ears, a brutal reminder that she was, and always would be, an outsider in his world of sorrow. The thaw between them froze solid. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. For days, he barely spoke to her, and when he did, his voice was clipped and impersonal. Maribel retreated into herself, her work her only solace. The little wooden animal sat unfinished on the mantelpiece. Her hands had forgotten how to create. Then came the blizzard that changed everything. It was a true monster of a storm, a whiteout that erased the line between earth and sky. It had been raging for 2 days, trapping them all inside. The water barrels were running low, bundled from head to toe, leaving only her eyes exposed to the elements. Maribel fought her way to the pump, a rope tied between the cabin and the pump house, her only guide. The wind was a physical force, shoving and clawing at her, and the snow was so deep it was like wading through molasses. Each trip left her more breathless, her muscles burning, her lungs aching from the frigid air. On her final trip, as she wrestled a full, heavy bucket back toward the cabin, the world began to tilt. The swirling white around her dissolved into a dizzying gray. A searing heat bloomed behind her eyes, and a profound weakness washed through her limbs. She knew she was ill. The fever that had been simmering for a day had finally broken her. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the bucket tipping over and sending a plume of precious water into the snow. She tried to get up, but her body would not obey. Just a little farther, she thought, her eyes fixed on the hazy outline of the cabin door, but the cold was seeping in. A deep, numbing cold that promised a final, dreamless sleep. Her last conscious thought was of her son, Samuel, and a quiet whisper that she would be with him soon. She woke to warmth, not the searing heat of fever, but a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to come from all around her. She was lying in a bed, a real bed, with a soft mattress and heavy wool blankets, not her simple cot in the loft. A cool, damp cloth was on her forehead. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a lantern. She turned her head, her muscles aching, and saw him. Beau Callahan was sitting in a chair beside the bed, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He looked exhausted, his face drawn and pale beneath his tan. He had not shaved in days, and the dark stubble accentuated the sharp lines of his face and the grim set of his mouth. He was watching her. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough with fatigue. What happened?" she whispered, her throat raw. "You collapsed. The fever took you." He reached out and placed a large, calloused hand on her forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "It's coming down. You've been out for a full day." She tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. I'm in your bed." "It was closer," he said, a simple, practical explanation that did not begin to cover the truth. He had carried her. He had brought her into his own private space, the most intimate part of his home, and laid her in his own bed. He had taken care of her. She lay back, her mind struggling to make sense of it. Through the haze of the fever, she had vague memories, the feeling of being lifted by strong arms, the low murmur of his voice, urging her to drink water, the constant, comforting weight of his presence in the room. He had not left her side. She drifted back to sleep, and when she woke again, it was morning. The storm had broken, and pale sunlight streamed through the window. She felt weak, but the fever was gone. She sat up slowly, the blankets pooling around her waist. The chair beside the bed was empty. For a moment, a pang of disappointment hit her. He was gone. Then she saw him. He was asleep on the floor, curled on a thin horse blanket, his back against the wall. His long legs were stretched out, his boots still on. One arm was flung over his eyes to block out the morning light. He had not gone to his cot. He had not even gone to the empty bunkhouse. He had stayed right there, on the hard floor, all night long. He had stayed to make sure she did not die. Maribel stared at his sleeping form, at the vulnerability in the line of his neck, the exhaustion etched into his face. This rough, silent, broken man had saved her life. Not because it was his duty, but because he had wanted to. An emotion she could not name, warm and overwhelming, swelled in her chest. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was something deeper, something more terrifying. It was a connection. That moment was a turning point. When he woke, he was as distant as ever, but the air between them had changed. The cold silence was replaced by a quiet awareness. Their eyes would meet across the room and hold for a second too long. When he handed her a log for the fire, his fingers would brush against hers, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the cold. A fragile tenderness was taking root in the frozen ground of their solitude. As she regained her strength, Bo seemed to find reasons to keep her close. "The wolves are getting bold," he said one afternoon, his voice gruff. "You need to know how to use a rifle, for your own protection." He took her out behind the barn, the snow crunching under their boots. The rifle was heavy in her hands, its wooden stock and cold steel barrel feeling alien and dangerous. He showed her how to load it, how to sight it, his instructions clipped and precise. "Stand here," he commanded, positioning her in front of a line of empty cans he had set on a fence post. He stood behind her, his chest almost pressing against her back. "You're holding it too tight. Relax your shoulders." He reached around her, his large hands covering hers on the rifle. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the warmth of his body seeping through her coat, could smell the scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. His fingers adjusted hers, showing her the proper grip. His scarred cheek was just inches from hers as he leaned in to show her how to look down the sight. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his voice low in her ear. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." She did as he said. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the winter stillness. One of the cans flew off the fence post. A small, shaky smile touched her lips. "I did it." "You did," he said. His hands were still on hers. Neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, to the space between their bodies, charged with an energy that was both frightening and exhilarating. He pulled away first, his movement abrupt, clearing his throat and stepping back. But she had felt it. His breath had hitched at the same moment as hers. That night, she sat by the fire, mending one of his shirts. A button had come loose, and she was sewing it back on with the neat, even stitches. The cabin was quiet save for the crackle of the fire and the soft scratch of her needle against the cloth. Bo sat at the table, cleaning the rifle, the lamplight glinting off the metal. The quiet between them was no longer empty. It was full of unspoken things. She finished her task and bit off the thread. Without looking up, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Callahan." "Bo," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "My name is Bo." She looked up at him then. His hands were still on the rifle, but his eyes were on her. She took a breath, feeling reckless. "Bo, Why don't you go to town to find a wife?" The question hung in the air, audacious and deeply personal. He stopped what he was doing, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Wives expect things," he said finally, his voice flat and empty. "Things I can't give." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, an admission of his own brokenness, his own inability to feel what other men felt. She saw in that moment the vast, lonely wasteland of his heart. Her own heart ached in response, with a fierce, protective sympathy. She lowered her gaze back to the shirt in her lap, her fingers stroking the rough flannel. "I wouldn't," she whispered, the words so soft they were almost carried away by the crackling flames. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of her quiet promise. It was an offering, a confession. "I am as broken as you are. I would expect nothing because I believe I deserve nothing." He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. He did not look at her. He strode to the door, grabbed his coat from a peg, and walked out into the cold, dark night, leaving her alone by the fire with his mended shirt in her hands and her foolish, hopeful heart breaking in the silence. Spring did not arrive. It fought its way into existence, a brutal and beautiful battle against the tyranny of winter. The snow receded in dirty, stubborn patches, surrendering the land inch by grudging inch. The frozen ground softened into a thick, greedy mud that sucked at a man's boots. The creeks, choked with ice for months, finally broke free with a roar, their waters running high and brown. The air, for so long a sharp, sterile thing, grew heavy with the scent of wet earth, pine resin, and the promise of new life. With the thaw came an explosion of work. The ranch, which had been hibernating under a blanket of white, stirred and awoke with a groan. Fences needed mending where the weight of the snow had snapped the wire. The herd, lean and shaggy after the long winter, had to be rounded up from the sheltered valleys. The very soul of the land was changing, and with it, the dynamic inside the small log cabin. Maribel was no longer confined to the hearth and home. The isolation of winter had forged a strange, unspoken partnership between them. And now, in the spring, it was put to the test. Beau began to take her with him on his daily rides. He had given her a gentle mare, an older horse with a calm demeanor, and taught her to ride with the same gruff impatience with which he taught her everything. But she was a quick study, her small frame finding a natural balance in the saddle, her hands light on the reins. They would ride out at dawn, the world washed in the pale, hopeful light of morning. For hours, they would work in a shared silence that was no longer empty, but companionable. They rode the fence lines, Maribel holding the posts steady while Beau stretched the wire taut with a grunt of effort. They tracked stray cattle, her keen eyes often spotting a calf hidden in a thicket that he had missed. She learned the contours of his land, the dip and swell of the hills, the names he had for the creeks and the rock formations. She was learning the shape of his world, and in doing so, was becoming a part of it. Their meals changed. Too, they were no longer silent, tense affairs. They would sit at the table, bone-weary and splattered with mud, and a quiet understanding would pass between them. He would watch her as she ate, a small frown of concentration on her face, and he would feel a strange loosening in his chest. She would look up and catch his eye, and the look that passed between them was one of shared experience, of a day's hard labor met and conquered together. The tension was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of their lives, but now it was tempered with a deep, growing familiarity. They resisted it, both of them, like a horse resists a new bit. They were two solitary creatures, wary of closeness, but the gravity of their shared solitude was pulling them inexorably together. The arrival of the post rider was a rare event, a herald from a world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He came one afternoon in late April, his horse steaming, a small leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He brought coffee, salt, and a single letter for Beau. Maribel was in the cabin, kneading bread dough, her hands white with flour. Beau took the letter and stood by the window, slitting it open with his thumb as he read. She saw his whole body tense. The muscles in his back went rigid. The scar on his jaw seemed to stand out, a stark white line against his sun-darkened skin. He read the letter twice, then slowly folded it and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "My brother, Raymond, is coming to visit," he said, his voice flat. He was not looking at her. He was looking out the window, at the distant, snow-capped peaks. He and his wife, they will be here in 2 weeks. They will stay for a few days. Maribel's hands stilled in the dough. Company. Visitors. The thought sent a small, irrational flicker of panic through her. This cabin had become her world, her sanctuary. The thought of outsiders intruding upon it, upon the fragile peace she had found, was unsettling. "That will be nice," she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say. He turned from the window then, and his eyes were cold, shuttered. He had retreated back into the fortress of himself. "While they are here, it would be best if you took your meals in the bunkhouse with Silas and Jebediah. And you will need to sleep in the barn. They will need your room in the loft." The word struck her with the force of a physical slap. The barn, like an animal, like the hired help she was. All the shared rides, the quiet meals, the longer looks, all of it dissolved in that single, practical statement. She was a matter of convenience, an employee to be moved and managed as he saw fit. The fragile intimacy they had built was a figment of her imagination. A hot wave of shame and hurt washed over her, so intense it made her dizzy. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand why he would do this, but she did none of those things. She looked down at her flour-covered hands, at the soft, pliable dough. She took a slow, deep breath. "I understand," she said, her voice a quiet, hollow thing. "I will make sure the room is ready for them." If he noticed the pain in her voice, he gave no sign. He just gave a curt nod and went outside, leaving her alone with the bread and the sudden, crushing weight of her own foolishness. The 2 weeks leading up to his brother's arrival were strained. The easy companionship was gone, replaced by a formal courtesy that was colder than the deepest winter freeze. Maribel threw herself into her work, cleaning the cabin with a frantic energy, as if she could scrub away her own humiliation. Branding season began a few days before the expected arrival. It was a time of controlled chaos, of dust and sweat and the acrid smell of burning hair. The air was filled with the bellowing of cattle, the shouts of men, and the sizzle of the hot iron. Maribel worked at the fire, keeping the branding irons heated to a perfect cherry red, her face smudged with soot, her eyes stinging from the smoke. It happened in a flash. A young, wild-eyed bull, separated from its mother, broke free from the holding pen. It charged blindly across the corral, its head low, its small horns like daggers. Silas shouted a warning. Jebediah scrambled up the side of the fence, but Maribel was caught in the open, a fresh iron in her hand, her back to the charging animal. She heard the shouts and turned, her eyes widening in terror. There was no time to run, no time to think. The world slowed down, the bellowing of the bull filling her ears. She was frozen, a rabbit in the path of a hawk. Then Beau was there. He moved with a speed and grace she had never seen, a blur of motion. He threw himself at her, his body colliding with hers, sending them both tumbling into the thick dust of the corral. He twisted as they fell, taking the brunt of the impact himself, his body shielding hers. The bull thundered past, its hooves missing them by inches, and crashed into the far side of the fence. Maribel lay beneath him, the breath knocked out of her, her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of him was heavy, solid, and for a moment, all she was aware of was the frantic beat of his heart against her cheek, the scent of him, dust, sweat, and something primal, something purely him. He pushed himself up, his face grim. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," she whispered, shaking her head.
I don't think so.
He got to his feet and pulled her up with him. He was covered in dust, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light she had never seen before. It was only then that she saw the blood. A dark, ugly gash ran down his forearm, from his elbow to his wrist. The bull's horn must have grazed him as it passed.
You're bleeding,
she said, her voice trembling. He glanced down at his arm as if just noticing the injury. It's nothing.
It is not nothing,
she insisted, her own fear replaced by a sudden, fierce need to take care of him. Come to the cabin. I need to clean it. He started to argue, but she grabbed his uninjured arm and pulled, her grip surprisingly strong. Now, Bo. She did not know where the authority in her voice came from, but he did not resist. He let her lead him away from the chaos of the corral, away from the watching eyes of his men, and into the quiet of the cabin. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She sat him down at the table and fetched the basin, a bottle of whiskey, and a roll of clean bandages. Her hands did not shake as she worked. She poured whiskey over the wound, and he hissed in a sharp breath, his muscles cording in his neck, but he did not pull away. She cleaned the gash gently, her touch sure and steady, her face a mask of concentration. He was silent, watching her. He watched the way she pursed her lips as she worked. He watched her slender fingers as she carefully wrapped the bandage around his arm, her touch both clinical and incredibly tender. The sight of her, so calm and capable, her face smudged with soot, her hair coming loose from its pins, did something to him. This woman, this quiet, resilient woman whom he had just saved from being trampled to death, was the same woman he was going to send to sleep in the barn like a stray dog. The injustice of it, the sheer wrongness of it, rose up in him like a gorge. "Maribel," he said, his voice a low rasp. She looked up, her blue eyes wide and questioning.
She was just tying off the bandage.
"You are not sleeping in the barn," he said. The words came out rough, torn from some deep, hidden place inside him. She stared at him, her hands frozen on his arm.
"But your brother—"
"I do not care," he said, his voice growing stronger, rougher. "That is your room. You will stay in it. This is your home. Your home." The words hung in the air between them, shimmering with a weight of meaning that stole her breath. He had never said anything like it before. He had never acknowledged her as anything more than a temporary fixture in his life. As if on cue, the sky, which had been bright and clear all day, suddenly darkened. The wind began to howl, and a moment later, a spring squall hit the cabin with the force of a freight train. Rain hammered against the roof and streamed down the window panes, blurring the outside world into a wash of gray. The storm had broken outside, and a different kind of storm was about to break within. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He moved toward her, and she rose to meet him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He stopped a foot away from her, his tall frame blocking out the light from the window. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, the exhaustion and confusion and raw, undeniable need warring there.
This is a mistake,"
he whispered, but he did not move away. The rain beat against the cabin, a relentless, drumming heartbeat. The air was thick, electric. She knew she should step back, should retreat to the safety of her role as his housekeeper. But she could not. She had seen behind the mask, had felt the truth of his heart against her cheek in the dust of the corral. She was tired of being safe. She was tired of being a ghost.
"Then make the mistake,"
she whispered, her voice trembling. And that was all it took. He closed the distance between them in a single step, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking the line of her jaw. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of a dam breaking after years of being held back. It was rough and hungry, tasting of dust and rain and whiskey, and a loneliness so profound it ached. She did not resist. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. His hands slid from her face down to her waist, pulling her hard against him. He was all hard muscle and unyielding strength, and she melted against him, a lifetime of fear and sorrow dissolving in the heat of his touch. He kissed her like a starving man, his mouth moving over hers with a raw, desperate need that she met with her own. He pulled back for a breath, his forehead resting against hers, his breathing ragged. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with 1,000 unspoken emotions. He seemed about to say something, to pull away, to rebuild the walls between them. She saw the hesitation, the guilt beginning to dawn in his eyes, and a wave of panic washed over her. She could not bear for him to be gentle now. She could not bear his pity or his regret. She needed this. She needed the honesty of this storm.
"Do not be gentle,"
she begged, her voice a raw whisper.
"Please."
A shudder went through his powerful frame. Her words, her plea for something other than the tenderness he did not know how to give, seemed to shatter the last of his control. With a low groan, he backed her against the rough-hewn logs of the kitchen wall, his mouth finding hers again, deeper this time, more possessive. The kiss was a fever, a whirlwind of pent-up passion and pain, and she clung to him, trembling, as the rain swept the world clean outside. Later, how much later she did not know, the storm passed. The rain softened to a gentle patter, and the last of the evening light filtered back into the room. Gray and subdued, they stood apart, the charged air between them crackling with the aftermath. He would not look at her. He stood by the window, his back to her, one hand braced against the log wall. His shoulders were slumped, as if he carried the weight of the world upon them. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "That," he began, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat and started again. "That should not have happened." Each word was a nail in the coffin of the beautiful, terrible thing that had just passed between them. Maribel felt the blood drain from her face. It was not regret in his voice. It was dismissal, a cold, hard shutting of a door she had not even known he had opened. The heat of the moment drained away, leaving her chilled to the bone, exposed and utterly humiliated. He had taken what he wanted, and now he was ashamed. She felt used. She felt worthless. She felt like the woman her father had always told her she was. He turned then, and his face was a mask of anguish. He looked like a man being torn in two. "Maribel, He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I cannot. There are things. You do not understand." He could not articulate it. The guilt for Eleanor, the fear of his own feelings, the conviction that he was a broken thing that would only destroy anything soft or good that it touched. The words would not come. She did not want to hear his excuses. She saw only his rejection. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile gesture of self-protection. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "I am the housekeeper. I forgot my place. It will not happen again." She walked past him, her head held high, and climbed the stairs to her loft. Her room, her home, he had called it. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. The next morning, she did not come down. Beau sat at the table, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands, and listened to the sounds of her moving about overhead. He had not slept. He had spent the night wrestling with his own demons, and he had lost. He knew he had hurt her, had taken her raw, honest plea and thrown it back in her face. But he did not know how to fix it. He did not know how to be the man she deserved. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. She descended slowly, carrying a small, tied bundle. It held all of her worldly possessions. Her face was pale and set, her eyes shadowed and empty. She did not look at him. She walked toward the door. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. The thought of this cabin without her, of the silence returning, empty and crushing, was more than he could bear. He was at the door before she could reach it, his body blocking her way. "Do not go," he whispered, the words raw with a desperation that shocked him. She finally looked at him then, and what he saw in her eyes made his heart clench. There was no anger. There was just a vast, empty expanse of pain. "There is no reason for me to stay."
I am the reason,
he said, his voice cracking. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them, afraid to touch her. "Maribel, please. I do not know how to be what you want. I do not know how to be a whole man. But I cannot lose you." His words were a frayed rope thrown to a drowning woman. Maribel clung to it, not because she believed it would hold, but because letting go meant sinking into an abyss she knew she would not survive. And so, she stayed. But the cabin, once a sanctuary, was now a cage of unspoken words. The space between them was populated by the ghost of that rain-swept afternoon. Every time she passed the kitchen wall, she could feel the phantom pressure of his body against hers. Every time he looked at her, she saw the memory of the kiss in his eyes, followed swiftly by a shudder of guilt and confusion. They moved around each other with a fragile, painful courtesy, like two spooked horses in the same corral, wary of any sudden movement that might shatter the brittle truce. He had confessed he could not lose her, but he made no move to claim her. They did not speak of what had happened. The words "that night" were never uttered, but they were the loudest sound in the suffocating silence. He was a man locked in a prison of his own making, and she was the woman on the other side of the bars, her hand outstretched, her hope dwindling with each passing day. He had asked her to stay, but he had not given her a reason why, other than his own selfish need not to be alone. And Maribel, who had never been truly wanted by anyone, mistook his need for a flicker of affection. A few days later, a smart, polished buggy pulled up to the ranch. Raymond and Beatrice Callahan had arrived. Raymond was Beau's younger brother. Though he looked the older of the two, he was softer, thicker around the middle, with a face unlined by hardship and hands that had never known a day of hard labor. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, a stark contrast to Beau's rough denim and flannel. He was a man of the city, a man of business, and he looked at the raw, untamed land of his brother's ranch with an expression of faint, polite distaste. His wife, Beatrice, was a thin, severe woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She had pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing and forgave less, and lips that were perpetually pursed in a silent judgment of the world's many imperfections. From the moment she stepped out of the buggy and her expensive leather shoes sank into the mud, she looked upon the ranch, the cabin, and Maribel with an air of undisguised condescension. Maribel had, as instructed, prepared the loft room for them. She had scrubbed the floors, aired out the bedding, and even placed a small jar of early spring wildflowers on the bedside table. When Beatrice swept into the room, she ran a gloved finger along the windowsill, inspected it for dust, and then looked at the wildflowers as if they were weeds. "Quaint," she said, the word a small, sharp icicle. The first dinner was a stifling, uncomfortable affair. Maribel served the roasted chicken and vegetables she had painstakingly prepared, then retreated to the kitchen, as if her very presence might contaminate the air of civility Raymond and Beatrice were struggling to maintain. But Beau would not have it. "Maribel," he called, his voice rough. "Sit with us." She froze, a dish rag in her hand. It was a command, but it was also, she thought, a small act of defiance against his brother's world. She saw the flash of irritation in Beatrice's eyes, the polite surprise on Raymond's face. Hesitantly, she took a seat at the far end of the table, feeling as out of place as a field mouse at a king's banquet. "So, you are the help," Beatrice said, her tone making the words sound like an affliction. "She is the housekeeper," Beau corrected. his voice low and dangerous. Raymond, ever the diplomat, smiled smoothly. "My brother is lucky to have found someone so capable in such a remote location. Tell us, Miss, I am sorry, I did not catch your name."
"It is Maribel,"
she said quietly. "Maribel," Raymond repeated, testing the sound of it. "A lovely name. And where is your family from?" Maribel's blood ran cold. The question was innocent, a standard piece of dinner table conversation, but to her it was a landmine.
I do not have any family to speak of,"
she stammered, her eyes fixed on her plate.
"Oh, surely everyone has family,"
Beatrice pressed, a predatory glint in her pale eyes. "A young woman like you does not simply appear in the middle of Wyoming without a history." "Beatrice," Beau warned, his hand tightening into a fist on the table. "I am just making conversation. Dear brother-in-law," she said with a tight smile, "I am curious about the sort of person you have living under your roof. It is a matter of propriety." Maribel felt the walls closing in. The food in her stomach turned to lead.
"I am from the East,"
she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"I came west for a new start."
Her hesitation, her vague answers, were all the confirmation Beatrice needed. She had scented a secret, and Maribel knew with a sickening certainty that this woman would not rest until she had unearthed it. For the next 2 days, Maribel felt Beatrice's eyes on her constantly, watching, analyzing, judging. The woman was a hawk, and Maribel was the mouse, scurrying from one task to the next, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She saw Beatrice go into her loft room more than once, under the guise of fetching a shawl or a book. Maribel knew she was snooping, her heart pounding with the terror of discovery. Her past was a fragile, ugly thing, locked away in a small wooden chest at the foot of her cot, and she prayed that Beatrice would overlook it. Her prayers went unanswered. The chest contained her few meager possessions, her mother's shawl, a change of clothes, and, tucked into the lining, a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. She did not know why she kept it, perhaps as a reminder of the sin she could never outrun, a form of penance she inflicted upon herself. The headline was stark and cruel: "Preacher's daughter cast out for sinful ways." The final dinner was a quiet, tense affair. A storm was brewing outside, the sky a bruised and angry purple. Raymond was speaking of land speculation, his voice a droning monotone. Beau was silent, his mood as dark as the approaching storm. Maribel was a bundle of nerves, starting at every sound. Then Beatrice placed her fork down with a delicate clink.
"Beau,"
she said, her voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. "Raymond and I have been talking. We are concerned for you." Beau looked up, his eyes narrowed. "Concerned about what?" "About your companion," Beatrice said, her gaze sliding to Maribel, cold and triumphant. "We feel there are some things you should know about the woman you have allowed into your home." Maribel's heart stopped. She knew. Beatrice reached into the pocket of her dress and produced the folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. She unfolded it with a small, dramatic flourish and placed it on the table beside Beau's plate. "I found this in Miss Maribel's room," she announced. "It seems our quiet housekeeper has quite a scandalous past." Beau did not look at the clipping. His eyes were fixed on Maribel, a storm of confusion and dawning horror in their depths. Raymond leaned over to read it, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. "It tells a most sordid tale," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with sanctimonious pleasure, "about a preacher's daughter in a small town in Pennsylvania, a young woman who brought shame upon her family and her church by bearing a child out of wedlock." The room was utterly silent, save for the rising howl of the wind outside. Maribel could not breathe. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt the eyes of all three of them on her, pinning her to her chair. "The child, thankfully, did not survive," Beatrice said with a chilling lack of compassion. "But the shame did.
The girl was cast out, shunned by her entire community. One can hardly blame them. A woman of such loose morals. To think she has been living here, under your protection. It is hardly suitable. She is used goods. Beau, unfit to be in the home of a respectable man.
Maribel looked at Beau. She did not look at the smug, cruel face of Beatrice or the shocked, judgmental face of Raymond. She looked only at Beau.
Her entire world, her entire future, hung on this single moment. She pleaded with him with her eyes. Say something. Defend me. Tell them they are wrong. Tell them it does not matter.
He sat as if carved from stone. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. The scar on his jaw was a livid slash. His jaw worked, as if he were trying to form words, but none came out. He just stared at the newspaper clipping, then at her, his face a mask of conflict and paralysis. He was trapped between the world of his family's judgment and the world he had started to build with her. And in that crucial moment, he froze. He said nothing. He did nothing. He stayed silent. The silence was his answer. It was a roar of condemnation, louder than any of Beatrice's accusations. It was a confirmation of everything Maribel had ever believed about herself, that she was unworthy, that she was stained, that she was undeserving of defense or love. A single tear traced a hot path down her cold cheek. With a choked sob, she pushed her chair back from the table. The sound of its legs scraping against the floor, a shriek of agony in the silent room. She turned and fled. She ran from the cabin, from the pity and the scorn and the terrible, terrible silence of the man she had foolishly allowed herself to care for. She ran out into the storm. The rain hit her immediately, cold and violent, soaking her thin dress in seconds. She did not know where she was going. She just ran, blindly, stumbling through the mud and the darkness, the wind tearing at her hair and the rain washing the tears from her face. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, and then she fell to her knees in the mud. Her head bowed, and she wept. She wept for the child she had held for only 2 days, the small, perfect boy she had named Samuel. She remembered his tiny, grasping fingers, the soft down of his hair. She remembered the prayers she had screamed to a silent, empty sky as his small body grew cold in her arms. God had been silent then, just as Beau had been silent now. She was utterly, completely alone. She did not know how long she knelt there in the storm. Hours, perhaps. The rain eventually softened to a miserable drizzle, and a pale, watery light began to seep into the eastern sky. She was soaked to the bone, shivering with a cold that went all the way to her soul. She began to walk, a slow, aimless shamble in the general direction of the town, a full day's journey away. It did not matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She heard the sound of a horse behind her and did not turn. It came closer, its hooves sucking in the thick mud. It stopped beside her. Maribel. It was Beau's voice. She kept walking. He dismounted, and his footsteps followed her. He came to stand in front of her, blocking her path. His face was haggard in the gray light of dawn. He was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. He had been looking for her all night. "I am sorry," he said, the words raw and inadequate. She looked up at him then, her eyes empty of everything but a vast, desolate sorrow. She felt nothing, not anger, not hatred, just a profound, bottomless disappointment. "You stayed silent," she said, her voice a dead, flat thing. "That is all I needed to know." She tried to walk around him, but he caught her arm, his grip surprisingly gentle. "It is not that simple. You do not understand." "Oh, I understand," she said, pulling her arm from his grasp. "I understand that I am a source of shame for you. I am the scandal you cannot afford in front of your proper family. I am the housekeeper, and you were silent." She walked past him, her back straight, and did not look back. She walked all the way back to the cabin, a long, miserable trek through the mud. His brother and wife were gone.
Their buggy was no longer there. He followed her on his horse, a silent, mounted sentinel of regret. She went straight up to the loft, to her room. She did not have much to pack. She folded her spare dress, her mother's shawl, and the few small, carved animals she had made, and placed them in her bundle. She did not take the newspaper clipping. She left it on the bed, a final, bitter testament to what had happened there. When she came down the stairs, he was waiting for her at the bottom, his face a mask of despair. He watched her as she walked to the door, her small bundle in her hand. "You were never just the help," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. The words were a ghost of what she had needed to hear the night before. Now, they were just salt in an open wound. She stopped at the door but did not turn to look at him. "Goodbye, Mr. Callahan," she said, and then she walked away. She walked out of the cabin and down the muddy track that led away from the ranch, away from the man who had shown her a glimpse of what home could feel like, only to snatch it away. She did not look back. She just kept walking, a small, solitary figure against the vast, empty canvas of the plains, disappearing into the cold morning mist. The town of Laramie was a world away from the vast silence of the Callahan Ranch. It was a place of dust and noise, of wagon wheels creaking in the rutted streets, the constant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the boisterous laughter that spilled from the swinging doors of 3 different saloons. For Maribel, it was a place to be invisible. Months bled into one another, turning the vibrant green of summer into the brittle gold of autumn. She found a small, clean room in a boarding house run by a stern but fair widow named Mrs. Gable. She paid for her keep with her needle, taking in mending work from the town's more respectable families. Her days fell into a quiet, monotonous rhythm, the prick of the needle, the soft rasp of thread against cloth, the clatter of dishes from the boarding house kitchen below. She kept to herself, her eyes downcast when she walked through town, her voice soft and infrequent. She built a wall of anonymity around herself, and, for a time, it was enough. She was not happy, but she was safe from the ghosts of the ranch, and that was a kind of peace. But a woman alone is always an object of speculation. Her quietness was mistaken for aloofness, her solitude for shame. The owner of the largest saloon, a man with slicked-back hair and a diamond stick-pin named Silas Blackwood, took notice of her. He approached her one afternoon as she was leaving the general store. "A woman as pretty as you shouldn't be wasting her time sewing shirts for other women's husbands," he said, his voice a low, oily purr. "I could offer you a position at the Golden Nugget, a job with a bit more excitement, entertaining the patrons, singing, perhaps." Maribel knew what entertaining men meant. It was a life she would rather die than lead. "Thank you, sir, but I am content with my work," she said, her voice firm and cold, and she walked away without a backward glance. She refused his offer, but the encounter left its stain. Rumors, like tumbleweeds, began to drift through the town, catching on the corners of conversations and whispers behind cupped hands. The men in town started to look at her differently, with a sly, speculative gleam in their eyes. The respectable women who had given her work began to find excuses to take it elsewhere. The wall she had built around herself was beginning to crumble. One evening, a drifter passing through town saw her sitting on the boarding house porch. His eyes narrowed in a flicker of recognition. He was a man who had once hauled freight through Pennsylvania, and he had a long memory for gossip. A week later, a letter arrived for him at the Laramie post office. He sought Maribel out. "Heard some news from back home you might want," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "Your father, the preacher, he passed on. Went to meet his maker about a month ago." Maribel felt a strange, hollow emptiness at the news. There was no grief, no sorrow. The man who had sired her had been dead to her for years. "But the folks in that town?" the drifter continued, a cruel smirk on his face. "They ain't forgotten you. Your name is still mud in that valley. Seem some sins, they just follow a person. He tipped his hat and sauntered away, leaving her with the cold, hard truth that she could run 1,000 miles, but she could never outrun her own story. While Maribel was trying to disappear, Bo Callahan was actively destroying himself. The moment she had walked away from the ranch, the life had gone out of the place. It became, once again, just a collection of buildings, a place of work without a heart. The cabin felt cavernously empty, the silence he had once craved now a suffocating presence. Every corner held a memory of her, the way she would sit by the fire carving her little animals, the scent of baking bread, the sound of her quiet footsteps in the loft above. He let the ranch deteriorate. Weeds choked the vegetable patch she had so carefully tended. A section of fence collapsed in a windstorm, and he did not bother to fix it. His work became a mechanical, joyless thing, and when the work was done, he found his solace at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Silas and Jebediah watched him with a wary distance, their conversations with him becoming short and practical. The light had gone out of their boss, replaced by a grim, simmering anger that he directed at the world, but mostly at himself. One evening, drunk and stumbling, he made his way to the lone grave behind the barn. He stood before the simple wooden cross, the name Eleanor barely visible in the fading light. For years, this place had been his shrine to a perfect, uncomplicated grief. But now, it felt different. The memory of Eleanor, once a source of righteous sorrow, was now a source of bitter self-recrimination. "I did it again," he whispered to the silent grave, the words torn from him, thick with whiskey and despair. "I had something good, something real, and I broke it." He sank to his knees in the dirt, the first time he had ever done so. "I loved you," he said, his voice cracking. "I think I did, but it was the idea of you I loved, the idea of what I lost. She was real, and I let her go. I do not know how to love right. Eleanor, I only know how to hold on to ghosts." He stayed there for a long time, a dark, kneeling shape in the twilight, confessing his sins to a woman who could no longer hear him. A few weeks later, a telegram arrived. It was a rare and ominous event. Bo tore it open with trembling hands. It was from a man in Laramie, Reverend Martin of Colebrook, Pennsylvania, asking after a Maribel Heath. "Says he is her uncle. Thought you should know." The words hit Bo like a physical blow. Her uncle, from her old town. He knew, with a gut-deep certainty, that this man was not there for a happy reunion. He was a vulture, come to pick at old wounds. Without a second thought, Bo threw a saddle on his horse, shoved a few provisions into his saddlebags, and rode out, leaving the ranch and its ghosts behind him. He rode like a man possessed. The name Maribel, a frantic prayer on his lips. Maribel had just finished delivering a mended dress to the banker's wife when she saw him. He was a tall, gaunt man dressed in severe black, his face a stern, unforgiving landscape of sharp angles and thin lips. It was her Uncle Martin, her father's brother, a man who believed the world was a den of sin and that he was God's chosen instrument to purge it with fire and brimstone. He saw her at the same moment. "Maribel!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the street, causing passers-by to stop and stare. "Abomination, I have come to drag you back to God's grace." Fear, cold and familiar, seized her. "Leave me alone," she whispered, turning to flee. He was surprisingly fast. He caught her arm in a grip like an iron vice. "You will not run from your penance any longer," he snarled, his face close to hers, his breath smelling of stale coffee and self-righteousness. "You have shamed our family. You have shamed the memory of your father. You will come back with me. You will repent before the congregation. You will live out your days in service and prayer, and perhaps God will see fit to forgive your wretched soul." He began to drag her down the street, toward the small white church at the end of the road. People were watching now, whispering, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Maribel struggled, but he was too strong. "No!" she cried, her voice thin with panic. "I will not go back. You cannot make me." He cornered her against the whitewashed wall of the church itself, his body blocking any chance of escape. "I can and I will," he hissed, his face contorted with fury. "You are a harlot and a sinner, and you will do as I say." He raised his hand, and she flinched, expecting the blow that had been so common in her father's house. But the blow never landed. A hand, large and calloused and brown from the sun, shot out and clamped down on her uncle's wrist. The Reverend Martin cried out in pain and surprise, his grip on her loosening. Maribel looked up and saw him. Beau Callahan stood there, a figure of dust and fury. He looked as if he had ridden through hell itself. His face was gaunt, his eyes were bloodshot, but they burned with a fire she had never seen before. "Take your hand off her," Beau said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "And who are you to interfere in a matter of family and God?" the Reverend sneered. Beau did not answer with words. He twisted the Reverend's wrist until the man cried out again and released Maribel completely. Then, with his other hand, he balled it into a fist and drove it into the Reverend's jaw. The sound was like a thunderclap. The man of God staggered back, his eyes wide with shock, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. Beau was on him in an instant, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage. He grabbed the front of the Reverend's black coat and slammed him against the church wall. "You will never touch her again," he snarled. "You will never speak her name again. You will get on the next stage out of this town, and if I ever see your face again, I will finish what I have started here." He punctuated the threat with another brutal punch, and the Reverend crumpled to the ground in a heap of black cloth and groaning piety. Beau stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving. Before he turned to Maribel, the crowd that had gathered melted away, not wanting any part of the silent fury that radiated from this stranger. He looked at her, his eyes filled with 1,000 things he could not say. He gently took her arm, his touch the very opposite of her uncle's. He led her away from the church, away from the scene of her humiliation and his redemption, and helped her into the small buggy he had rented at the livery. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Maribel sat beside him, wrapped in a blanket he had given her, the storm inside her slowly beginning to calm. He had not asked for explanations. He had not demanded to know her story. He had simply seen her in trouble, and he had acted. His actions were the apology his words could never form. They arrived back at the ranch well after dark. The cabin was cold and unwelcoming, but he quickly had a fire roaring in the hearth. He made her a cup of coffee and then stood before her, his hat in his hands, looking as vulnerable as she had ever seen him. "If you will still have me," he said, his voice quiet and rough. It was not a command. It was a plea. That night, as she sat by the fire, wrapped in her mother's shawl, he did something that shattered the last of her defenses. He walked over to her, his boots silent on the wooden floor, and he knelt before her. A man like Beau Callahan did not kneel. He knelt in the dirt by Eleanor's grave, but he had never knelt to a living soul. He took her hand in his calloused palm warm and strong around her fingers. He looked up at her, the firelight dancing in his tired, earnest eyes, and he said the one word she never, ever thought she would hear, the one word that held the power to heal all the wounds, to erase all the shame. Bride. It was not a question. It was a promise, a declaration, a name to replace all the ugly names the world had given her. Tears, hot and cleansing, streamed down Maribel's face. They were not tears of sorrow or of pain, but of a profound, overwhelming release. She looked at this broken, beautiful man kneeling before her, and she saw not a savior, but a partner, another lonely soul who had found his way home. Crying silently, she laid her other hand over his, her answer given without a single word. Life on the ranch resumed, but the very air had changed. The silence that returned was not the heavy, oppressive silence of before, but a soft, companionable quiet, full of unspoken understanding. They did not have a proper wedding. There was no preacher, no congregation, no witnesses save for the vast, empty sky and the distant, watching mountains. One clear, cold morning, they stood by the creek that marked the edge of his property. Bo, who had spent the previous evening in the workshop, produced 2 rings. They were not made of gold or silver, but of old fence wood, worn smooth by years of sun and wind. He had carved them with his own hands, their surfaces imperfect and full of character, like the 2 people they were meant for. He slipped one onto her finger. It was warm from his pocket. "With this," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide, "I claim you." She took the other ring and slid it onto his large, calloused finger. "With this," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I am found." There were no other words. He simply leaned down and kissed her. A slow, gentle kiss that tasted of clean air and a future she had never dared to dream of. His first act as her husband was one of profound symbolism. That afternoon, he climbed the ladder to the loft, her loft, and began to carry her things down. He took her small cot, her bundle of clothes, the little wooden animals she had carved, and he brought them to the main room. He cleared a space for her by the hearth, the very heart of the cabin. He built a small bookshelf into the log wall for her few possessions and placed her cot there, covering it with a new, thick wool blanket he had purchased on his last trip to town. He was not just giving her a warmer place to sleep. He was moving her from the periphery of his life to its very center. He was tearing down the last wall between them, the one that separated the rancher from his housekeeper. Their new status did not go unnoticed. On their next trip to Laramie for supplies, the whispers followed them like flies. Maribel felt the stares, the women who would stop talking when she entered the general store, the men who would nudge each other and smirk. She kept her eyes down, her heart beginning its familiar retreat into the safety of shame. But Bo would not allow it. As a woman passed them, her lips curled in a sneer. Bo stopped. He did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene. He simply placed his hand on the small of Maribel's back, a gesture of quiet, unshakable possession, and met the woman's gaze with a look as cold and hard as winter granite. "Good morning, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Mrs. Callahan." The woman's jaw dropped. The word spread through the town like wildfire. He was not hiding her. He was claiming her, openly and without apology. His men, Silas and Jebediah, had followed his lead without question. They treated her with a new, deeper respect, calling her ma'am with a deference that acknowledged her as the lady of the ranch. The town was slower to come around, but Bo's quiet defiance had planted a seed of doubt in the fertile ground of their gossip. The event that truly turned the tide happened in the dead of a cold, rainy night. One of the mares, a gentle creature Maribel had grown fond of, went into a difficult labor. The foal was turned wrong, and the horse was in terrible distress. Bo and Silas worked for hours, their efforts proving fruitless. The mare was growing weaker, her cries of pain a terrible sound in the night. "We are going to lose them both," Silas said, his grizzled face grim. "No," Maribel said, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of the barn. She had been watching, her heart aching for the suffering animal. She handed the lantern to Bo and approached the mare, speaking to her in a low, soothing tone, drawing on a deep, forgotten well of instinct. She worked with a gentle, patient strength. Her small hands were surprisingly strong, her touch sure and steady. For another hour she worked, never giving up, murmuring to the mare, encouraging her, until, at last, with a final, shuddering cry, the foal was born, alive and healthy. The town veterinarian, who had been summoned hours before, finally arrived just as Maribel was toweling off the wet, trembling foal. He stood in the doorway of the barn, soaked to the bone, and watched in stunned silence as Maribel coaxed the newborn to its feet and guided it toward its exhausted mother. He saw not a fallen woman, but a healer, a woman of profound compassion and quiet strength. His version of the story, told the next day over coffee at the general store, was far more compelling than the whispers of a forgotten scandal. Respect in the West was a currency earned through grit and competence. And that night, Maribel had proven she had both in spades. One quiet evening, as she was putting away some of Beau's mended shirts, her hand brushed against a leather-bound bundle at the bottom of his chest. It was a stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed to Eleanor, in Beau's neat, careful hand, but they were not sealed. She pulled one out. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. It was dated years ago. She knew she should put it back, that this was a private piece of his heart she had no right to see. But she also knew that this ghost was the last shadow between them. She took the bundle and went to him where he sat by the fire, cleaning a bridle. She said nothing, simply held them out to him. He looked at the letters, and a deep, shuddering sigh went through him. "I wrote them after," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After she was gone. I could not stop, but I could never send them." "Read one to me," she said softly. He shook his head, unable. "I cannot." "Then I will," she said. She sat beside him, untied the ribbon, and began to read the top letter aloud. Her voice was soft and steady in the quiet room. The letter was full of the simple hopes of a young man. Plans for the ranch, a description of a sunset. It was a letter full of a life that was never lived. As she read, a tear slid down Beau's scarred cheek, then another. He did not make a sound, but he wept, silent tears of a grief he had held inside for far too long. He was not just mourning Eleanor. He was mourning the man he had been, the innocence he had lost. When she finished, she refolded the letter and placed it, and the rest of the bundle, into the heart of the fire. They watched together as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the last vestiges of his past rising with the smoke and disappearing into the night. He turned to her, his face washed clean by his tears, and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a replacement, not as a penance, but as his future. That night, they came together not with the desperate, stormy hunger of before, but with a deep, quiet tenderness. It was a slow discovery of each other, an act not of need, but of a profound and patient love in the safety of his arms. Maribel felt the last of her old wounds begin to heal. For the first time in her life, she felt wholly and completely cherished. The seasons turned again. Summer's heat gave way to the crisp air of another autumn. Life on the ranch was good, filled with hard work and a quiet, steady happiness that Maribel had never thought possible. One afternoon, she found Beau by the corral, repairing a broken latch. She came and stood beside him, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Beau," she began, her voice a little shaky. There is something I have to tell you." He stopped his work, giving her his full attention. She took a deep breath. We are going to have a child." He froze. The hammer fell from his hand, landing in the dust with a soft thud. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked down at her still flat stomach, then back up to her eyes, which were shining with a mixture of fear and hope. He said nothing. He simply sank to his knees in the dirt in front of her, his big frame trembling. He reached out a shaky hand and gently, reverently, laid it on her belly. His head bowed, and she saw his shoulders begin to shake with the force of a silent, overwhelming emotion. It was not sorrow, not this time. It was a joy so profound, so unexpected, it had struck him speechless. In the final, golden days of autumn, they walked hand in hand to the place behind the barn. to the small, wind-swept patch of ground where Eleanor's cross stood. They did not go to mourn. They carried with them a small shovel and a slender, hopeful sapling, a young cottonwood tree. Together, they dug a hole in the rich earth a few feet from the old grave. They placed the sapling into the ground, its young roots reaching into the soil that had once been a place of only sorrow. As they worked, their hands touching in the dirt, they were not burying the past, but planting a future beside it. When they were done, they stood back, looking at the small tree, a symbol of life after death, of a new beginning. A cool wind swept down from the high peaks, rustling the few remaining leaves on the branches. Bo wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, the word full of all the love and reverence in his heart. "Bride." She turned her face up to his, a soft, sure smile on her lips, and for the first time, she gave him the name he had earned, the name that made them whole. Husband. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers and subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel to share your thoughts.